Hello, Darklings! So today I wanted to talk about vampires again, and I've done at least a few videos on vampires because it's been a subject of study for me since I was, I don't know, 7, maybe? And I know I did one that was kind of talking about vampire mythology and vampire folklore and the origin stories for all of that, and I know I've done one for the Vampire Chronicles. And this one was kind of more of the psychological perspective. This is a little bit more why we love them so much. In general, the main population of the world has an interest in vampires because of a lot of basic human fears, which has to do with fear of the dark, fear of isolation, and fascination with the outsider. And pretty much any story of a vampire can tell you that the vampire is going to be in the fringe. It's going to be on the outskirts. It's going to be something that's isolated from the rest of humanity. And it makes for a rather interesting study to do stories on. So there are many, many vampire books in this world, and they go through periodic booms of popularity. And I know towards the end of the last decade, in the 2000s, we ended up having a very big boom of vampire books, unfortunately brought about by a not-so-good book series, Twilight, which I will unfortunately admit to having read as a teenager. But then when I got to the end of the 4th book, I had this whole moment of, wait, what the fuck? However, they kind of went with that. The main reason why those books in particular were so approachable, even if they're rubbish vampires, is Bella's a very easy to slip into character for a POV because she's a fantasy fulfillment. Edward is fantasy fulfillment, and so the whole thing is kind of set up so that you're seeing the author's dream come true, and it's kind of bullshit but psychologically interesting. However, there were whole other slews of series that got away with mass publication, such as the Sookie Stackhouse novels, the Morganville Vampires, the House of Night, the Vampire Diaries, all of these other book series that ended up getting published and running for long periods of time, more than 30 years after the release of the Vampire Chronicles' first book, Interview with the Vampire, in 1976. Vampires have populated popular fiction since the beginning of the 19th century, most prominently with John Polidori's The Vampire in, I believe, 1830. I can't remember precisely. It's been a while since I've read it. However, there are a whole slew of occasions where vampires come back into fashion within popular culture and within history, and it's a cyclical thing, like almost any other trend in existence. Things come in cycles. So Dracula had a lucky break in that it kind of came at the crest of a new cycle when it came out. I don't know if I've really given the full rant. I probably have on my issues with Dracula, in that it has rubbish continuity. A lot of the writing style is a little bit jilted and varied because it was most likely written by someone other than Bram Stoker, because he did have his friends assist him with his writing because he didn't know how to write a novel properly. That being said, I am fond of this book and I will defend it to death. But that book gained its utmost popularity due to its approachability and its kind of almost pulp content in its shocking violence and storytelling and all of that fun stuff. But there are a whole other bunch of 19th century vampires that were incredibly popular, such as the Barney the Vampire, Penny Dreadful serials, and Sharon Le Fanu's Carmilla, which was kind of the introduction to lesbian vampires, which then became a very prevalent, very, very prevalent trope within film in the 20th century. So vampires have populated popular culture for a long time, and people either sympathize with them or hate them, or in equal measure, mostly because of the different things that they could potentially stand for. We're not talking about these creepy beasts that are children born with a caul, or redheads that die before the age of 30 that can be killed by the shadow of a church bell. We're talking about what modern fiction tells us a vampire is: a creature of the night that can be burned by the sun, the stake through the heart, all of that very, very popular stuff that people have known within this, I don't know, past 50 years since childhood because of fictions such as the 1931 Dracula film and the 1958 Dracula film, and all these different vampires that have permeated history, that have made themselves a very integral part of popular culture. Anyway, so I've been on a Vampire Chronicles kick, and I received feedback that say I'm not alone, and I find that very, very funny. Since I did my Vampires Chronicles video, I have since read Pandora, the Vampire Armand, and Blood and Gold, and Vittorio the Vampire. And so those are individual stories of the different vampires within that particular universe and that particular canon. And so you're seeing the individual perspectives of these other characters outside of Lestat within that series. And each one tells of their centuries of isolation, of their centuries of discovery, of the different things that they have gone through in their life, and how they have existed on the edge of time, and how they have prowled the world. A lot of people harbor all of these weird insecurities about being on the edge of the map. And perhaps this goes on to one of the other points that I like to make about the goth community. So my first introduction to vampire in correlation with goth was, of all things, a rather silly, fluffy series of books called the Vampire Kisses books. I have mentioned them in a couple other videos, I believe. And they're a little silly, they're a little lighthearted, they're very teenage, and I think the romantic focus is a little bit too much, but overall, the main character of Raven Madison was my first proper introduction to a fictional goth character. And I ended up really liking her, really sympathizing her, even at 16, and this was the first time I'd ever heard the word goth properly. And I ended up liking her because she was unapologetic about her love for a mythological creature, and then in her reality, that ended up being a thing. But it kind of tied in with the rest of her interests, and you could see, even if she wasn't making the conscious connection, the author was for her, that her interest in the vampire is her interest in everything else that she loves, in this outsider perspective of this lonely wanderer kind of mentality. For her, it was less about the murdering, the blood drinking, all of the horrific stuff that was attached in old folklore, and more the romantic, broody figure of isolation, of all of this, which has resonated very, very deeply within the Gothic community over the years. And so we ended up getting terms like, for example, a very prevalent goth club in the 1980s starting in London was the Batcave. And part of the reason why you get a term such as Batcave is that vampires have been long associated with bats, specifically vampire bats, and by proxy, goths have been kind of referred to as bats because of that creatures of the night connotation. So it goes in with the whole romantic poets thing. It goes in with this whole Byronic hero. It goes in with all these different things that kind of make up a lot of the basic foundation of what goth can be. So there's the constant argument of, oh, you can't just say that goth is just about fashion. Oh, goth is about the music. It's like, well, goth is about a lot of things because it started because of a literary movement that was inspired by something else, because you get all these terms that kind of pile up and shift over the course of time because that happens. But Gothic literature is a romantic movement recalling a medieval time. And it's kind of an interesting correlation. So the vampire as the Byronic hero has become a more popular trope in the past 50 years than it ever was before. You end up getting very sympathetic vampire characters that you end up really caring for and wanting to support. A book I was introduced to a couple of years ago that I never would have heard of otherwise is called The Delicate Dependency, that kind of talks about the vampiric quest for knowledge, and it's less focused on the killing and the blood and all the sensual aspects of that, and more heavily on the isolation of the millenniate kind of thing. And it's a rather interesting, odd little novel. But there have been so many different approaches to what vampires are look in fiction, and even if some of them are significantly more ridiculous, less believable, and less like than others, such as the Twilight vampires that make very, very little sense, what I will respect about those vampires in particular is that they are primarily, above all, predators, which is a lot of what the basic mythology of a vampire will be. Aside from that, it's whatever. But the idea of a vampire being predator and of being isolated because of a secret is also, I don't know, it resonates pretty deeply with the human mentality of things. So this is a babble that could go on and on and on in a significantly less structured manner. But to kind of wrap it up, my thing is, whenever I know that other people, especially other goths in particular, are heavily focused on vampires as well, I do get a little bit warm and fuzzy, because I'm just like, see, this is kind of our unintentional token symbol of our separation from mainstream society. I don't know, it's kind of our mascot or something. And so for anyone that's ever curious, about goth, usually your best friend and kind of learning about it is going to be the perspective of the vampire in classic literature. This creature of isolation, loneliness, of age-old, whatever. They're kind of the mentality and the spirit and the soul of what goth unintentionally came to be. So, you know, just some thoughts. Agree or disagree, it's just some babble, but it's a perspective I figure I should throw out there. Till next time, Darklings.